"Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Rodriguez said, and Judge Harrison Wells felt his entire world crumble in front of his daughter's eyes. Welcome back, beautiful souls. If this story already has you captivated and you're ready for an emotional journey that will stay with you long after it ends, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, because tomorrow, I'm bringing you another powerful tale of redemption that you absolutely cannot miss. But for now, settle in and prepare your hearts. This story starts now. The soft jazz filtering through Bella Vista's dining room couldn't mask the tension crackling between tables. Judge Harrison Wells, though no one here knew his title, sat across from his 16-year-old daughter Zoe, watching her push expensive pasta around her plate like she was solving a puzzle. "Dad, you're doing that thing again," she said without looking up. "What thing?" "That judge thing, where you study everyone like they're about to confess to something." Harrison's laugh came easier than it had in months. "Occupational hazard, I suppose." He reached across the white tablecloth and gently touched her hand. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I know I've been distracted lately." The custody hearing was next week. 3 months since the divorce was finalized, and already his ex-wife was pushing for reduced visitation. "Too busy with your career," she'd said. "Zoe needs stability, not a part-time father who lives at the courthouse." Maybe she wasn't wrong. Harrison had thrown himself into his work after the separation, taking on more cases, staying later, building a reputation as one of the youngest black judges to preside over major criminal cases in the state. But sitting here now, watching his daughter's guarded expression, he wondered if success was worth the distance growing between them. "Tell me about school," he said, putting his phone face down on the table. "And don't say fine, I want details." For the first time that evening, Zoe smiled. Really smiled. "Well, there's this boy." 3 miles across town, Officer Danny Rodriguez was finishing his shift with the same restless energy that had been eating at him for weeks. 28 years old, 4 years on the force, and he still felt like he was proving himself every single day. The other officers had accepted him, sure, but acceptance wasn't respect. Respect came from results. Another quiet night in paradise, his partner Mike called from across the locker room. "Speak for yourself," Danny muttered, slamming his locker harder than necessary. "I haven't written a decent citation in 3 days. "Relax, Rodriguez. Not everything has to be life or death." But that was exactly the problem. Danny had grown up in this city, watching his neighborhood get eaten alive by crime, while cops drove through like they were touring a zoo. When he'd finally gotten his badge, he'd sworn he'd be different. He'd be the kind of officer who actually made a difference. His radio crackled. "All units, we've got reports of suspicious activity at Bella Vista Restaurant on 5th Street. Possible credit card fraud in progress." Danny's pulse quickened. "That's us, Mike." "It's probably nothing. Some tourist's card got declined. Or it's something." Danny was already heading for the door, "and we're about to find out." The restaurant's ambient lighting cast everything in warm gold when they arrived, but Danny's trained eyes went straight to the details that didn't fit. 2 men in expensive suits sat near the window, one significantly older, white, gesticulating with his hands. At a corner table, a black man in a navy blazer sat with a teenage girl, both of them laughing about something. The manager, a nervous man with thinning hair, approached them immediately. "Officers, thank you for coming. I hate to bother you, but we've had some irregularities tonight." "What kind of irregularities?" Danny asked, his hand instinctively resting near his radio. "Well, it's probably nothing, but that gentleman over there," the manager nodded toward Harrison's table, "his card was declined 3 times, different cards. And the thing is, well, look at him. Look at his clothes, his watch. Either he's having some kind of financial emergency, or, Mike prompted. Or the cards aren't his." Danny studied Harrison from across the room. The man did look successful. Expensive watch, well-tailored clothes, confident posture. But Danny had learned not to trust appearances. Some of the smoothest criminals he'd encountered looked exactly like pillars of the community. Has he been acting suspicious otherwise? He keeps checking his phone, looking around, and when I mentioned the card issue, he got defensive, said there must be some mistake, that he's never had problems before. The manager wrung his hands. I really don't want to cause trouble, but my boss says if we suspect fraud. Danny nodded. He'd seen this before, identity thieves who targeted upscale restaurants, figuring they could blend in long enough to use stolen cards for expensive meals. The confidence was often the biggest tell. Guilty people overcompensated. We'll handle it, he said, discreetly. As they approached the table, Danny noted every detail, the way the man's shoulders tensed, how his hand moved protectively toward his wallet, the way the teenage girl looked up with curious rather than concerned eyes. All of it painted a picture Danny had learned to read. Harrison noticed the officers before they reached his table. In his years on the bench, he'd developed a sixth sense for law enforcement, could spot the particular way they moved through a room. But these two were heading directly toward him, and the knot in his stomach told him this wasn't a social visit. "Excuse me, sir," the younger officer said, his voice professionally neutral. "I'm Officer Rodriguez, this is Officer Thompson. We're responding to a report about some credit card issues. Could we speak with you for a moment?" The restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Harrison felt every eye in the room turn toward their table, felt the familiar weight of being the only black face in a sea of white stares. Zoe's hand found his across the table, her grip tight with sudden fear. "Of course," Harrison said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system, "though I'm not sure what this is about. I've had some technical difficulties with my cards tonight, but, sir, we're going to need to see some identification," Rodriguez interrupted, "and we'd appreciate it if you could step outside with us." The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. Not here, not in front of Zoe, not when everything was finally going well between them. "Officers, I'm sure we can resolve whatever this is right here. I'm Judge Harrison Wells, and, sir, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." Rodriguez's hand had moved to his belt. "Step outside, now." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Harrison could feel his daughter's eyes on him, could see the confusion and fear growing in her face. In that moment, all his courtroom authority, all his carefully built dignity, felt as fragile as paper in the rain. What would you do if you were wrongly accused in front of your child? Have you ever experienced a moment where everything you'd built felt like it could crumble in seconds? Share your thoughts below. Your story might help others facing similar challenges. The cool evening air hit Harrison's face like a slap as the restaurant door closed behind them. Through the large windows he could see Zoe still sitting at their table, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling her mother. The thought made his stomach clench tighter. "Sir, we need to see identification and the credit cards you attempted to use tonight," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the particular authority that came with a badge and the assumption of guilt. Harrison reached slowly for his wallet, every movement deliberate and visible. 20 years of living while black had taught him the choreography of police encounters. "Here's my driver's license, my judicial ID and the cards in question." His voice remained steady, professional. "As I mentioned inside, I'm Judge Harrison Wells. I preside over criminal court downtown." Rodriguez barely glanced at the IDs before handing them to his partner. "Anyone can get fake credentials made, we've seen it before." "These aren't fake." The words came out sharper than Harrison intended. He caught himself, forced his voice back to neutral. "Officer Rodriguez, if you call downtown, they can verify." "Sir, here's what's going to happen." Rodriguez stepped closer, and Harrison caught the scent of coffee and authority. "We're going to run these cards, check your background. If everything comes back clean, you'll be on your way. If not," he let the threat hang in the air. Through the window, Harrison could see more diners had turned to watch the scene unfolding outside. Some had their phones out. In the age of social media, his humiliation would be viral before they got home. "Dad?" Zoe's voice came from the restaurant doorway. She'd ignored the hostess trying to keep her inside. "Zoe, go back to the table," Harrison said without taking his eyes off Rodriguez. "What's happening? Why are they—" "Miss, you need to step back inside," Officer Thompson said, finally speaking up. "Don't tell my daughter what to do." The words erupted from Harrison before he could stop them, and he saw Rodriguez's posture shift immediately. "Sir, I need you to calm down." "I am calm," but Harrison's hands were shaking now, rage and humiliation warring in his chest. "I'm calm. I'm cooperative, and I'm telling you that this is a mistake." Mistakes don't explain why 3 different cards got declined. Technical glitches explain it. Bank security protocols explain it. What doesn't explain it is why you assumed I was committing fraud instead of considering that sometimes cards just don't work. The silence stretched between them, loaded with everything nobody was saying. Rodriguez's jaw tightened and Harrison realized with sick certainty that they were past the point of reasonable conversation. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back," Rodriguez said. The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. "Excuse me? You're being detained while we verify your identity and investigate possible credit card fraud." "You're arresting me?" Harrison's voice cracked on the last word. "We're detaining you. In handcuffs, standard procedure." Harrison looked through the window one more time. Zoe was pressed against the glass now, tears streaming down her face, the hostess's hand on her shoulder the only thing keeping her from running outside. 20 years of building a life, a reputation, a relationship with his daughter, and it was all crumbling because of 3 declined credit cards, and the assumption that a black man in an expensive restaurant must be up to something. "Dad, don't let them do this." Zoe's voice was muffled by the glass, but clear enough to shatter something inside Harrison's chest. He turned around. The handcuffs were cold against his wrists, the metal a shocking contrast to the warm evening. Each click of the mechanism echoed in his ears like a gunshot. Around them, the sidewalk had begun to fill with onlookers, other restaurant patrons, people walking by, all of them watching as Judge Harrison Wells was arrested like a common criminal. "This is wrong," he said quietly, more to himself than to the officers. "Sir, you have the right to remain silent." Rodriguez's voice faded into background noise as Harrison stared through the restaurant window. Zoe had both hands pressed against the glass now, and even from here, he could see her shoulders shaking with sobs. His phone was buzzing in his pocket, probably her trying to call him, trying to understand why her father was being led away in handcuffs. The patrol car felt smaller than Harrison had imagined. The plastic seats, the wire mesh, the smell of disinfectant and desperation. He'd sentenced hundreds of people who had sat in similar cars, but he'd never considered the particular humiliation of being displayed like this, the way the cage reduced you to something less than human. As they pulled away from the restaurant, Harrison caught one last glimpse of his daughter through the window. She was on her phone again, probably calling her mother, probably crying into the receiver about how the police had taken Daddy away. The custody hearing was next week. Rodriguez was quiet in the front seat, occasionally speaking into his radio in codes Harrison didn't recognize. In the rearview mirror their eyes met for a moment, and Harrison saw something flicker across the officer's face, doubt, maybe, or the first stirring of uncertainty. "Officer Rodriguez," Harrison said quietly, "when you run my credentials, when you realize who I am and what you've done, what will you tell my daughter about why this was necessary?" Rodriguez's eyes flicked away from the mirror. "Sir, if you are who you say you are, then this will all get sorted out. And if the damage is already done? If her faith in the system and me is already broken?" The radio crackled with static, dispatch confirming they were en route to booking. Through the wire mesh, Harrison could see the courthouse where he worked looming in the distance, its windows dark except for the security lights. Tomorrow he was scheduled to hear arraignments. Tomorrow he would sit in judgment of others. Tonight he sat in the back of a police car, wondering if his daughter would ever look at him the same way again. "The thing about justice, Officer Rodriguez," Harrison said as they pulled into the station, "is that it's supposed to be blind, not stupid." Rodriguez didn't respond, but his knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and Harrison realized that somewhere between the restaurant and here, the young officer had begun to understand the magnitude of what he'd set in motion. The booking process was clinical in its efficiency. Fingerprints, photos, paperwork. Each step a small humiliation, another chip in the armor he'd spent decades building. The desk sergeant, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, processed his information with professional neutrality until his occupation came up. "Judge Wells?" She looked up from her computer screen, confusion creasing her brow. "You're Judge Harrison Wells?" "Yes." She glanced at Rodriguez, who was standing nearby, suddenly very interested in his paperwork. "And you arrested him for—" "Suspected credit card fraud," Rodriguez said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty. The desk sergeant's expression shifted to something Harrison recognized from his own courtroom, the look of someone trying to figure out how a situation had gone so spectacularly wrong. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "I think there might have been a misunderstanding." The fluorescent lights in the booking area cast everything in harsh white, making Harrison's expensive navy blazer look cheap and his skin ashen. He sat on a metal bench, still in handcuffs, watching the desk sergeant's fingers fly across her keyboard while Rodriguez paced nearby like a caged animal. "Your Honor," Sergeant Martinez said after what felt like an eternity, "I've confirmed your identity. You're scheduled to preside over court tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Your record is, well, it's spotless." Harrison said nothing. The validation felt hollow now, too little and far too late. Rodriguez stopped pacing. How was I supposed to know? He didn't look like, he caught himself, but the words hung in the air anyway. "Didn't look like what, officer?" Harrison's voice was quiet, dangerous. "I meant in that restaurant with the card problems." Rodriguez's face had gone red. "Anyone could have been a criminal because I'm black and had technical difficulties with my credit cards." Harrison stood slowly, the handcuffs making the movement awkward. "Is that your professional assessment?" "That's not what I said." "It's exactly what you said." Harrison took a step closer, and more importantly, it's what you thought. The moment you saw me, a black man in an expensive restaurant having card troubles, you didn't think technical glitch or bank security protocol, you thought fraud. Sergeant Martinez cleared her throat. "Officers, I need those cuffs removed. Now." Rodriguez fumbled with his keys, and Harrison felt the metal restraints fall away. He rubbed his wrists, feeling the indentations the cuffs had left behind like brands. "Your Honor, I sincerely apologize," Martinez said. "This should never have happened. We'll expedite your release, and what?" Harrison's composure finally cracked. "And pretend this didn't happen? Pretend my daughter didn't watch her father get arrested for trying to buy her dinner?" His phone had been buzzing constantly from the property bag on Martina's desk. Probably Zoe, probably his ex-wife, probably half the legal community who'd seen the videos by now. In the age of smartphones, humiliation traveled at light speed. "Sir, if you want to file a complaint," Rodriguez started. "A complaint?" Harrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Officer, do you understand what you've cost me? I have a custody hearing next week. My ex-wife is already arguing that I'm too focused on work, too unstable. What do you think she's going to say when she sees the footage of me in handcuffs?" Rodriguez's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I was following protocol." "Protocol?" Harrison's voice rose. "Your protocol was to assume the worst about a man having dinner with his daughter? Your protocol was to ignore his identification and arrest him anyway." The manager said, The manager said my cards were declined. Everything else, the assumption that I was lying, that my credentials were fake, that I was committing fraud, that came from you. The booking area had gone silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of phones ringing. Other officers had gathered at the edges of their conversation, watching the drama unfold with the fascination of rubberneckers at an accident. Martinez stood up. "Your Honor, your property and personal effects." She handed him his wallet, his keys, his phone. "Again, I apologize for this misunderstanding." Harrison looked down at his phone. 17 missed calls, most from Zoe. The most recent text, sent just minutes ago: "Dad, are you okay? Mom's on her way to get me. She's really angry. I'm scared." His chest tightened. Rebecca would use this. She'd twist it into evidence that he was reckless, unreliable, that Zoe wasn't safe with him. Never mind that he'd done nothing wrong. Never mind that he was the victim here. In the brutal mathematics of family court, perception mattered more than truth. "Officer Rodriguez," he said without looking up from his phone. "Yes, sir? Tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., you're going to walk into my courtroom for your hearing on the excessive force complaint filed against you last month." The color drained from Rodriguez's face. "Sir? Did you think I wouldn't remember?" "Danny Rodriguez, badge number 4471, complaint filed by Mrs. Chen regarding your conduct during a traffic stop." Harrison finally looked up, and his eyes were cold as winter. Funny how these things come full circle. "Your Honor, don't." Harrison held up his hand. "Don't make this worse by pretending you didn't know. You arrested a sitting judge, Officer Rodriguez. You humiliated him in front of his daughter and half a restaurant full of people because you assumed the worst about him. And now, by pure cosmic irony, I'm the one who gets to decide your fate." Rodriguez looked like he might be sick. "Judge Wells, what happened tonight? I was trying to do my job. You were trying to be a hero." Harrison pocketed his phone and straightened his blazer, "and instead you became exactly the kind of officer that gives good cops a bad name." "Sir, if I could take it back." "But you can't." Harrison started walking toward the exit, then stopped. "Officer Rodriguez, I want you to think about something tonight. I want you to think about my daughter, crying in that restaurant, watching her father get handcuffed. I want you to think about how many other daughters, sons, wives, and husbands you've traumatized because you decided to see criminals instead of human beings. Judge Wells, please. And then I want you to think about tomorrow, about walking into my courtroom and asking me to show you the mercy you didn't show me tonight." The exit doors opened with a pneumatic hiss, and Harrison walked out into the night air. Behind him he could hear Rodriguez saying something to Martinez, his voice tight with panic. The parking lot was mostly empty except for patrol cars and the Uber that Harrison called to take him back to his car at the restaurant. As he waited, his phone buzzed again. This time it was Rebecca. "I can't believe this, Harrison. Zoe is traumatized. We need to talk tonight." He closed his eyes and let the phone ring. Through the station windows, he could see Rodriguez still standing in the booking area, probably trying to figure out how to salvage his career from the wreckage of one catastrophic assumption. Tomorrow their roles would be reversed. Tomorrow Harrison would sit behind the bench in his robes, holding Rodriguez's future in his hands. Tonight he stood in a police station parking lot, wondering if the system he'd devoted his life to serving was capable of justice, or if it was just an elaborate machine for perpetuating the same old prejudices with official stamps and legal procedures. His Uber pulled up, a beat-up Honda driven by a college kid who mercifully didn't recognize him or ask questions. As they drove through the quiet streets back toward Bella Vista, Harrison stared out the window at the city he'd sworn to serve and protect through law and order. Somewhere out there, Rodriguez was probably lying awake, staring at the ceiling, realizing that his moment of poor judgment had collided with the one person in the city who could end his career with a single ruling. And somewhere else, Harrison's daughter was crying into her pillow, trying to understand why the world had suddenly become a place where Daddy could be taken away in handcuffs for buying dinner. The restaurant parking lot was nearly empty now, his BMW sitting alone under a streetlight, like evidence of a crime that never happened. Harrison sat in his car for a long moment before starting the engine, knowing that when he got home he'd have to call Zoe, call Rebecca, and somehow find words to explain the unexplainable. Tomorrow he would put on his robes and pretend that justice was blind. Tonight, he knew better. The courthouse lobby, at 8:30 a.m. buzzed with the familiar energy of another day in the justice system. Lawyers shuffled papers, defendants sat nervously with family members, and court officers moved with practiced efficiency. Harrison walked through it all in his black robes, nodding to colleagues, projecting the calm authority that had taken him years to perfect. Inside, though, he felt like he was moving underwater. He'd barely slept. The conversation with Rebecca had been brutal. Her lawyer was already drafting an emergency motion to modify custody, using last night's arrest as evidence of Harrison's instability and poor judgment. Zoe had cried on the phone until Rebecca took it away, cutting off their conversation mid-sentence. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," Rebecca had said. "You're so focused on being important on your career that you can't even take our daughter to dinner without ending up in handcuffs." The unfairness of it burned in his chest like acid. He'd done nothing wrong, and yet somehow he was the one paying the price. "Your Honor?" His clerk Janet appeared at his elbow. "The docket's ready. We have 17 cases this morning, including that excessive force hearing." Harrison's jaw tightened. "Officer Rodriguez." "That's the one. He's here early, looks nervous as a cat in a dog park." Janet lowered her voice. "Judge, I heard about last night. Are you sure you don't want to recuse yourself?" Judge Patterson could take the case. The thought had occurred to him. It would be the clean solution, the professional thing to do. Let someone else handle Rodriguez while Harrison dealt with the fallout from his arrest, but something stubborn and angry inside him refused to back down. "I can be impartial," he said. Janet's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced, but she nodded. "The officer's attorney requested a few minutes to speak with you before court begins. Something about a potential conflict." Of course they had. Rodriguez's lawyer had probably spent all night researching recusal procedures and conflict of interest statutes. They were going to try to get Harrison removed from the case before it even began. "Send them to my chambers," Harrison said. "Let's get this over with." 5 minutes later, Harrison sat behind his desk facing a nervous-looking public defender named Tom Walsh and Officer Danny Rodriguez, who looked like he hadn't slept any better than Harrison had. "Your Honor," Walsh began, "given the events of last evening, my client feels that I can't be fair to him?" Harrison interrupted. "That I'm too biased to hear his case objectively?" Rodriguez shifted in his chair. "Sir, I know how this looks. Do you?" Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying the young officer. In the harsh fluorescent light of his chambers, Rodriguez looked younger than he had last night, more uncertain. "Because from where I sit, Officer Rodriguez, it looks like you're about to ask the man you wrongfully arrested to step aside, so someone else can decide whether you violated Mrs. Chen's civil rights." "Your Honor," Walsh tried again, "the appearance of impropriety." "The appearance of impropriety," Harrison said quietly, "was Officer Rodriguez putting me in handcuffs because he assumed a black man having credit card trouble must be committing fraud." The room went silent, except for the distant sounds of the courthouse coming to life, phones ringing, conversations echoing in the hallways, the mechanical hum of justice grinding on. Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Judge Wells, what I did last night, I made a mistake." "You made an assumption," Harrison corrected. "And that assumption destroyed my evening with my daughter and may cost me custody of her. So forgive me if I'm not feeling particularly sympathetic to your concerns about fairness." "Sir, I know I can't undo what happened, but But you want me to recuse myself so you don't have to face the consequences in front of the man you humiliated. Harrison stood up, his robes rustling with the movement. Here's what's going to happen, Officer Rodriguez. I'm going to hear your case, because that's my job. I'm going to listen to the evidence about whether you used excessive force against Mrs. Chen, and I'm going to make a decision based on the law, not on my personal feelings about your judgment. Walsh looked like he wanted to object, but Harrison held up a hand. However, he continued, you should know that I spent most of last night thinking about what happened, not just to me, but to you. Do you know what I realized? Rodriguez shook his head. I realized that you probably go home every night thinking you're one of the good guys. You probably tell yourself that you're protecting and serving, that you're making a difference, and maybe most of the time you are. Harrison walked around his desk to stand directly in front of Rodriguez. But last night you weren't a good guy, officer. You were exactly the kind of cop that makes people afraid of the badge. Sir, I'm not finished. Harrison's voice was steady, but there was steel underneath it. You want to know about bias? About fairness? Here's what's fair. You're going to sit in that courtroom and face judgment from someone who knows exactly what it feels like to be on the wrong end of your assumptions. And maybe, just maybe, that will give you some perspective on what justice actually means. Rodriguez's face had gone pale, but he nodded. Yes, sir. Good. Harrison returned to his chair. Mr. Walsh, unless you have grounds for recusal beyond your client's discomfort, I'll see you both in court in 10 minutes. After they left, Harrison sat alone in his chambers, staring at the framed photo of Zoe on his desk. She was smiling in the picture, taken last year at her school's father-daughter dance. She'd worn a blue dress and insisted on dancing to every song, even the slow ones where she had to stand on his shoes. That girl felt like a stranger now. The Zoe he'd left crying in the restaurant last night was someone else, someone who'd learned that the world wasn't as safe as she'd thought, that even Daddy couldn't protect her from the casual cruelties of assumption and prejudice. His phone buzzed. A text from Rebecca. Judge Patterson called. He offered to take the Rodriguez case. You should let him. Harrison stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. The courtroom was packed when he entered at 9 a.m. sharp. Rodriguez sat at the defendant's table with his attorney, looking like he was facing a firing squad rather than a hearing. Mrs. Chen sat in the gallery with her family, the bruises on her wrist from Rodriguez's rough handling still visible even 2 weeks later. All rise, the bailiff called. The Honorable Judge Harrison Wells presiding. Harrison took his seat behind the bench, his robes settling around him like armor. From this angle he could see everything: the nervous twitch in Rodriguez's jaw, the hopeful expression on Mrs. Chen's face, the reporters in the back row who'd undoubtedly heard about last night's incident. Be seated, he said. We're here for the matter of Chen versus Rodriguez, case number CR 2024-1547. Mr. Walsh, is your client ready to proceed? Yes, Your Honor. Very well. Harrison looked down at Rodriguez, and for a moment their eyes met across the courtroom. Officer Rodriguez, you stand accused of using excessive force during a routine traffic stop, specifically grabbing Mrs. Chen by the wrist and causing injury when she attempted to retrieve her registration from her glove compartment. How do you plead? Rodriguez stood slowly. Not guilty, Your Honor. So noted. Harrison opened the case file, but his mind wasn't on the paperwork. It was on last night. On Zoe's tears, on the feeling of handcuffs cutting into his wrists. Let's proceed with testimony. As the prosecutor began presenting evidence, Harrison found himself studying Rodriguez's face, looking for signs of the man who'd arrested him last night. The confidence was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like remorse. But was it remorse for what he'd done to Mrs. Chen, or just fear of the consequences? The irony wasn't lost on him. Here they were, locked together in this formal dance of justice, neither able to escape the gravitational pull of what had happened between them. Rodriguez needed Harrison to be fair, and Harrison needed to prove to himself, to the world, to his daughter, that he could rise above personal hurt to serve something larger. But fairness, he was learning, was more complicated than he'd ever imagined. The prosecutor's voice filled the courtroom as she questioned Mrs. Chen, but Harrison's attention kept drifting to Rodriguez, who sat rigid in his chair, occasionally scribbling notes he probably wasn't reading. "Mrs. Chen, can you describe what happened when Officer Rodriguez approached your vehicle?" the prosecutor asked. The elderly woman's voice shook slightly as she spoke. "I was reaching for my registration in the glove compartment. My English, it's not perfect, so I was trying to find the right papers. Then suddenly he grabbed my wrist very hard and yanked me back." "Did you resist in any way?" "No, I was scared. I just wanted to show him my papers." Harrison watched Rodriguez's face tighten with each word. The young officer's jaw worked like he was chewing on something bitter. "Your Honor," Walsh stood up during a brief recess, "I'd like to call Officer Rodriguez to testify on his own behalf." It was a risky move. Most defense attorneys kept their clients off the stand in cases like this, but Harrison sensed Walsh was hoping that putting Rodriguez's face on his actions might humanize him, maybe even generate sympathy. Rodriguez walked to the witness stand like a man approaching his own execution. After being sworn in, he sat stiffly, his hands folded in his lap. "Officer Rodriguez," Walsh began, "can you tell the court about your background, how long you've been with the force?" "4 years, sir. I grew up in this city, in the Riverside neighborhood." Harrison knew Riverside. It was one of the rougher parts of town, where police calls came in daily for everything from domestic violence to drug deals. Not an easy place to grow up. "What made you want to become a police officer?" Rodriguez glanced briefly at Harrison, then back at his attorney. "My little sister was killed in a drive-by when she was 8. I was 12. The cops who came, they were good people. They stayed with us, helped my mom through everything. One of them, Officer Martinez, he's a sergeant now, he told me that sometimes the job isn't about catching bad guys, sometimes it's about being there when people's worlds fall apart." The courtroom was quiet. Harrison found himself leaning forward slightly, interested despite himself. "And is that why you became an officer?" "Yes, sir. I wanted to be the kind of cop who made a difference, who protected people." Walsh nodded. "Now regarding the incident with Mrs. Chen, can you walk us through what happened?" Rodriguez's hands tightened in his lap. "I pulled her over for a broken taillight. When I approached the vehicle, she seemed nervous, which isn't unusual, but when I asked for her license and registration, she started digging around in her glove compartment, and I couldn't see what she was doing." "What went through your mind?" "Honestly, I was scared." Rodriguez's voice dropped. 3 months ago, my partner got shot during a routine traffic stop. The driver pulled a gun from his glove compartment while my partner was looking at his license. Mike's okay now, but he swallowed hard. When I saw Mrs. Chen reaching around in there, not responding clearly to my commands, I reacted." Harrison felt something shift in his chest. Not sympathy, not yet, but the beginning of understanding. Fear made people do stupid things. He knew that better than most. "Officer Rodriguez," the prosecutor said during cross-examination, "you say you were scared, but Mrs. Chen is 72 years old and weighs maybe 90 pounds. What exactly were you afraid of?" "Ma'am, I've learned that danger doesn't always look dangerous." "So you grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises because you thought this elderly woman was a threat?" Rodriguez's face reddened. "I reacted based on my training and experience." "Your training taught you to physically assault senior citizens who don't speak perfect English." "Objection," Walsh called. "Sustained," Harrison said, but his tone was sharp. "But I'll allow the witness to answer the underlying question. Officer Rodriguez, do you believe your actions were proportionate to the threat you perceived?" It was the question that mattered, the one that would determine whether Rodriguez kept his badge or lost it. Harrison watched the young officer's face, seeing the internal struggle play out in real time. "Your Honor," Rodriguez's voice cracked slightly. "No, I don't." The admission sent a ripple through the courtroom. Walsh looked like he wanted to strangle his client, but Harrison found himself studying Rodriguez with new interest. "Can you elaborate?" "I was scared, and I let that fear make me see threats that weren't there. Mrs. Chen was just trying to comply with my request, and I hurt her because I was too afraid to think clearly." Rodriguez looked directly at Mrs. Chen for the first time. "Ma'am, I am so sorry. There's no excuse for what I did." During the next recess, Harrison retreated to his chambers, his mind churning. This wasn't the same cocky officer who'd arrested him last night. This was someone wrestling with the weight of his own mistakes, someone who seemed genuinely horrified by his own actions. But was it real? Or was it performance? Janet knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege of 20 years working together. "Judge, you need to see this." She handed him a manila folder. "Background information on Officer Rodriguez. I thought you should know." Harrison opened the folder, and the first thing he saw was a newspaper clipping from 4 years ago. The headline read, "Local teen saves drowning child at city pool." The photo showed a younger Danny Rodriguez, still in his lifeguard uniform, holding a 5-year-old who was very much alive and crying for his mother. There were other clippings. Rodriguez volunteering at a homeless shelter. Rodriguez organizing a toy drive for underprivileged kids. Rodriguez receiving a commendation for talking a suicidal man off a bridge. "There's more," Janet said quietly. "His partner, Officer Thompson. He was shot 3 months ago during a traffic stop, just like Rodriguez said. It was touch and go for a while." Harrison stared at the folder. This was the paradox that made his job so difficult. Good people could do terrible things when fear and prejudice collided with split-second decisions. Rodriguez wasn't a monster. He was a scared young man who'd let his trauma turn an elderly woman into a threat. Just like he'd let his assumptions turn Harrison into a criminal. "Janet," Harrison said slowly, "get me Officer Rodriguez's personnel file. Everything. Training records, psychological evaluations, the works. Judge, you sure you want to go down that road? I need to understand who I'm dealing with." An hour later, Harrison had his answer. Rodriguez's file painted the picture of an officer caught between good intentions and poor judgment. Excellent marks in training, stellar community involvement, but a pattern of escalating responses in situations involving minorities. 3 complaints in 4 years, all dismissed by internal affairs, but all following the same pattern. Fear turning into aggression, suspicion masquerading as procedure. The intercom buzzed. "Judge Wells? There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." "Who?" "Mrs. Chen's daughter, Amy Chen Martinez." Harrison's eyebrows rose. He'd seen the name in the case file but hadn't made the connection. "Send her in." Amy Chen Martinez was a woman in her 40s, professionally dressed, with her mother's delicate features but harder eyes. She sat across from Harrison's desk with the controlled anger of someone who'd been fighting bureaucracy for weeks. "Your Honor, I know this is unusual, but I had to speak with you." "Miss Chen Martinez, I can't discuss the case. I'm not here about the case. I'm here about Officer Rodriguez." She leaned forward. "He came to our house last night." Harrison felt his pulse quicken. "Excuse me?" "After his shift ended, he showed up at our door. My mother was terrified. She thought he was there to arrest her or something worse, but he wanted to apologize. In person." "What did he say?" "He said that he couldn't sleep, knowing that he'd hurt her. He said that his job was supposed to be about protecting people like my mother, not making them afraid." Amy's voice softened slightly. "He cried, Judge Wells. This big, tough cop sat in our living room and cried, because he'd grabbed an old woman's wrist too hard." Harrison sat back in his chair. What did your mother say? She forgave him. Just like that. Amy shook her head in amazement. 72 years old, comes to this country with nothing, gets roughed up by a cop, and she forgives him because he was brave enough to say he was sorry. And you? Do you forgive him? Amy was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. What I do know is that he didn't have to come to our house. He didn't have to put his pride aside and face the person he hurt. Most cops would have just hoped it went away. She stood to leave, then turned back. Judge Wells, I heard about what happened to you last night, with Officer Rodriguez. Harrison's jaw tightened. Miss Chen Martinez, my mother says that sometimes the universe puts the right people in the same place at the right time. She thinks maybe this is one of those times. Amy's eyes met his. She thinks maybe Officer Rodriguez needs to learn what it feels like to have someone show him mercy he doesn't deserve. After she left, Harrison sat alone with the weight of impossible choices. Outside his window, the city hummed with afternoon traffic, people going about their lives, most of them trusting that justice would be done fairly, blindly, without personal vendetta or private pain. His phone buzzed. Another text from Rebecca. Zoe's asking if you're okay. She wants to know if you're still angry at the police officer. Harrison stared at the message, thinking about his daughter's tears, about Mrs. Chen's forgiveness, about a scared young cop who'd made the worst mistake of his career twice in 24 hours. Tomorrow he would have to decide Rodriguez's fate. Tonight, he had to decide what kind of man and what kind of judge he wanted to be. Have you ever had to choose between justice and mercy? Sometimes the hardest decisions aren't about what people deserve, but about who we want to become. What would you do in Judge Wells' position? Share your thoughts below. The courthouse emptied as evening approached, but Harrison remained in his chambers, staring at the case files spread across his desk. Rodriguez's personnel record lay open beside Mrs. Chen's medical report, a study in contrasts, potential and damage, fear and consequence. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Come in. To his surprise, Officer Rodriguez stood in the doorway, still in uniform but looking smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of the day. Your Honor, I know I shouldn't be here. No, you shouldn't. Harrison set down his pen but didn't invite Rodriguez to sit. Court officers, bailiffs, there are proper channels. I'm not here about the case. Rodriguez stepped forward, then stopped, as if an invisible barrier held him back. I'm here about last night, about your daughter. The words hit Harrison like a physical blow. Officer Rodriguez. Danny. My name is Danny. He took another hesitant step, and I need you to know that I haven't stopped thinking about her face, about how she looked when I put you in handcuffs. Harrison's carefully maintained judicial composure wavered. You have no right. You're right. I have no right to anything, but I have a niece, Judge Wells. She's 15, just a year younger than your daughter, and last night I kept imagining how I'd feel if someone did to her father what I did to you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside, the sounds of the city settling into evening filtered through the windows, traffic, distant sirens, the ordinary chaos of life continuing despite the extraordinary weight of this moment. Why are you here, Danny? Harrison asked quietly, using his first name for the first time. Because I want to explain, not excuse, explain, about who I am, about why I became a cop, about why I made such a terrible mistake. Harrison studied the young officer's face. The cocky confidence from the restaurant was gone, replaced by something raw and honest. Sit down. Rodriguez took the chair across from Harrison's desk, the same seat he'd occupied that morning with his attorney, but this felt different, less formal, more human. Tell me about your sister, Harrison said. Rodriguez's eyes widened with surprise. How did you mentioned her in court. She was 8 when she died. Elena. Danny's voice softened around the name. She was, God, she was everything good in the world. Always laughing, always trying to take care of everyone. When the shooting happened, she threw herself over our neighbor's baby, saved that kid's life." Harrison felt something shift in his chest, not quite sympathy, but recognition, the pain of losing someone you die to protect. "I'm sorry. The cops who came that night, they didn't have to stay, but they did." Officer Martinez sat with my mom for hours while she cried. He helped us navigate the system, made sure the case didn't get buried. He showed me what it meant to serve people at their worst moments. "Is that why you became a police officer?" "I wanted to be him. I wanted to be the kind of cop who made things better, who protected the Elenas of the world." Danny's hands clenched in his lap. "Instead I became the kind who makes them afraid." Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying this young man who'd caused him so much pain, but was now sitting here vulnerable and broken. "What happened with Mrs. Chen?" "I was scared." Danny's voice was barely above a whisper. "Mike, my partner, got shot 3 months ago. Same kind of stop, same situation. I keep replaying it in my head, wondering if I could have prevented it, if I'd been faster or smarter, or..." He shook his head. "When Mrs. Chen reached into that glove compartment, I didn't see a 72-year-old woman trying to find her registration. I saw the gun that nearly killed my partner." "And with me?" Danny looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "With you I saw what I expected to see, a black man in an expensive restaurant with card problems, and I made assumptions, the same assumptions that get people hurt, that get people killed." He paused. "The same assumptions that traumatized your daughter." The mention of Zoe sent a fresh wave of anger through Harrison, but it was different now, cleaner, less about revenge and more about protection. "She called me daddy when you were putting me in handcuffs. Did you hear her?" "Yes." "Do you have children, Danny?" "No, sir, but I have that niece I mentioned, Sophia, and I keep thinking, if someone hurt her father because of their prejudices, because they saw a threat that wasn't there," Danny's voice broke, "I'd want to kill them." The honesty was startling. Harrison had expected denials, excuses, legal maneuvering. Instead, he was getting raw truth from someone who seemed to be drowning in his own guilt. "Why did you go to Mrs. Chen's house?" "Because I had to. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't look at myself in the mirror, knowing that I'd hurt someone, and just walked away. I needed her to know that I was sorry, that what I did was wrong, that she didn't deserve it." "And she forgave you?" Danny nodded, tears threatening. "Just like that. This woman I'd terrified, whose wrist I'd bruised, and she looked at me and said, 'You're young, you can learn to be better.'" He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't deserve that kind of grace." Harrison thought about his conversation with Amy Chen Martinez, about Mrs. Chen's belief that the universe had put them all in the same place for a reason. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was about more than just legal consequences. "What do you want from me, Danny?" "Nothing." The answer came quickly, firmly. "I don't want you to go easy on me tomorrow. I don't want special treatment because I'm sorry, or because I explained myself. What I want is for you to know that the man who arrested you last night isn't who I want to be, and I want you to know that I will spend the rest of my career, however long that is, trying to be worthy of the badge I disgraced." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of confession hanging between them. Harrison thought about Zoe, about the custody hearing next week, about the videos that were probably still circulating on social media, all the damage that couldn't be undone. But he also thought about Mrs. Chen's forgiveness, about a scared young cop who'd driven to an elderly woman's house to apologize, about the complexity of justice in a world where good people sometimes did terrible things. "Danny," he said finally, "I need you to understand something. What you did to me, to my daughter, it can't be fixed with an apology. The damage is done. I know, but I also need you to understand that I see who you're trying to be, and that matters, not legally, that's a separate issue, but as a man, as a father, as someone who's spent his career trying to figure out the difference between punishment and justice, it matters." Danny looked up, hope and fear warring in his expression. "I have a daughter who used to believe that the world was fundamentally fair," Harrison continued. "That good people were rewarded and bad people faced consequences. Last night you taught her that sometimes the world is cruel and random, and that even Daddy can't protect her from it." "Sir, but maybe," Harrison paused, choosing his words carefully, "maybe you can also teach her something else. Maybe you can show her that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define us forever, that sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalyst for becoming who we're meant to be." Danny's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that tomorrow, I'm going to rule on your case based on the law and the evidence, but tonight, I'm going to call my daughter and tell her about a police officer who was brave enough to admit he was wrong, who cared enough to apologize to the people he hurt, who's working to become the man he wants to be instead of the man his fear made him." "Judge Wells." "Harrison. My name is Harrison." He stood up and Danny rose with him. "And I want you to know something, Danny. You're not the first person to let fear make you do something you regret. You won't be the last, but you might be the first to turn that mistake into something better." They shook hands across the desk, and Harrison felt some of the anger that had been eating at him since last night begin to dissolve. Not all of it. Some wounds took time to heal, but enough to make room for something that looked like hope. "Harrison," Danny said as he reached the door, "thank you for listening, for treating me like a human being instead of just the guy who screwed up your life. We're all human beings, Danny. That's the part that makes this job so hard and so important." After Rodriguez left, Harrison sat alone in his chambers as darkness settled over the courthouse. His phone showed missed calls from Rebecca, text messages from Zoe, emails from colleagues who'd heard about the incident, the machinery of his life, grinding on despite everything. But for the first time since last night, he didn't feel like he was drowning in the wreckage of one man's poor judgment. Instead, he felt like he was standing at the edge of something new, a chance to show his daughter what real justice looked like, what mercy meant, what it took to rise above hurt and choose healing instead. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Tonight, though, he had hope. Harrison arrived at the courthouse the next morning feeling lighter than he had in days. The conversation with Danny had shifted something fundamental in his perspective, and his call with Zoe afterward had been their best in weeks. She'd listened as he explained about people making mistakes and finding the courage to grow from them, and for the first time since the arrest, she'd sounded like his little girl again. "Maybe the police officer isn't a bad person," she'd said. "Maybe he was just scared and made a bad choice." "Maybe he was, sweetheart. And maybe that's the most important thing to remember about people. We're all capable of both good and bad choices." But as Harrison walked through the courthouse lobby, he sensed something was wrong. Conversations stopped as he passed. Colleagues who usually greeted him warmly looked away. Janet met him at his chamber's door with an expression he'd never seen before, equal parts anger and pity. "Judge, we need to talk before court begins." "What's wrong?" She closed the door behind them and handed him a tablet. Channel 7 ran this story 20 minutes ago. The headline made Harrison's blood freeze. Judge's secret meeting with defendant raises ethics questions. Below it was a grainy photograph, clearly taken through his chamber's window, showing him shaking hands with Danny Rodriguez. The caption read, "Judge Harrison Wells met privately with Officer Danny Rodriguez hours before ruling on excessive force case." Harrison's hands shook as he read the article. Reporter Patricia Mills had somehow gotten wind of their conversation and was calling it a highly irregular private meeting that raises serious questions about judicial ethics and potential bias. The piece quoted unnamed courthouse sources suggesting that Wells was either seeking revenge or cutting a deal with the officer who'd arrested him. "How did they?" Harrison started, but Janet cut him off. "There's more." She swiped to the next screen. "Rebecca's attorney filed an emergency motion an hour ago. The legal document was brutal in its efficiency. Rebecca was asking for immediate supervised visitation only, citing not just the arrest but now the apparent ethical violations that suggested Harrison had compromised judgment and inability to maintain professional boundaries. Harrison sank into his chair, feeling the ground collapse beneath him. Everything he'd built, his reputation, his relationship with Zoe, his career was crumbling because he'd tried to do the right thing. "There's more," Janet said quietly. "More? Chief Judge Morrison wants to see you in his office now, and the State Judicial Ethics Committee has opened an inquiry." The walk to Chief Judge Morrison's office felt like a death march. Harrison had known Robert Morrison for 15 years, had considered him both mentor and friend, but the man who looked up from his desk when Harrison entered was neither. "Sit down, Harrison." Morrison was 73, silver-haired, and carried himself with the authority of someone who'd spent 5 decades in the law. His office walls were covered with photos of him with governors, senators, and Supreme Court justices. He was by all accounts incorruptible. "Bob, I can explain. Can you?" Morrison leaned back in his chair. "Because from where I sit, you met privately with a defendant in a case you're presiding over the day before you're supposed to render judgment. Do you have any idea how this looks?" "It wasn't about the case." "It doesn't matter what it was about." Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "The appearance of impropriety is impropriety, Harrison. You know that. I taught you that when you were clerking for me 20 years ago." Harrison felt his carefully constructed defense crumbling. "Bob," he came to apologize, "about what happened with my daughter. I thought—" "You thought wrong." Morrison stood and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse plaza. "I've spent 50 years building the reputation of this courthouse, Harrison. 50 years making sure the public trusts that justice is fair and impartial. And now I have reporters calling me, asking if our judges make deals with defendants in private meetings. There was no deal. It doesn't matter." Morrison spun around, his face flushed with anger. "Don't you understand? It doesn't matter what actually happened. What matters is what people think happened. And right now, they think one of my judges is either corrupt or compromised." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of a friendship fracturing under the pressure of professional duty. "What do you want me to do?" Harrison asked quietly. "I want you to recuse yourself from the Rodriguez case. Immediately. Let Patterson handle it. Bob. And I want you to take a leave of absence while the ethics committee investigates." The words hit Harrison like physical blows. A leave of absence was career poison. Even if he was eventually cleared, the cloud would follow him forever. Judges who took ethics leaves rarely returned to full authority. For how long? However long it takes. Morrison returned to his desk, suddenly looking every one of his 73 years. "Harrison, I'm trying to save your career here. If you fight this, if you try to stay on that case, they'll crucify you. The press, the committee, maybe even the state bar. Is your pride worth destroying everything you've worked for?" Harrison thought about Zoe, about the custody hearing, about the promise he'd made to himself to show her what real justice looked like. What if I was right to listen to him? What if understanding the person you're judging makes you a better judge, not a compromised one? Then you're a fool. Morrison's voice was sad now, disappointed. And you're going to lose everything because you couldn't follow the rules that protect us all. The walk back to his chambers felt endless. Reporters had gathered in the lobby, shouting questions he couldn't answer. His phone was ringing constantly, journalists, colleagues, friends wanting to know if the story was true. Janet met him at the door with more bad news. "Judge Patterson is here. He's ready to take over the Rodriguez case." "And Danny?" "Officer Rodriguez is in the hallway. He looks like someone kicked his dog." Harrison found Danny standing near the elevator, staring at the floor like it held the secrets of the universe. When he saw Harrison approaching, his face crumpled. "Judge Harrison, I am so sorry. I didn't know anyone was watching. I never meant for this to happen. I know. I should have realized that coming to your office would cause problems. I needed you to know that I was sorry, that I understood what I'd done wrong." Danny's voice broke. "And now I've destroyed your career too." Harrison looked at this young man who'd become both his greatest challenge and somehow his greatest teacher about the complexities of justice and mercy. "Danny, you didn't destroy my career. I did, by caring more about doing what felt right than following the rules designed to protect the system." "What happens now?" "Now Judge Patterson hears your case, and I figure out how to explain to my daughter that sometimes doing the right thing for the wrong reasons still gets you punished." Danny's eyes filled with tears. "I would take it all back if I could. The arrest, the meeting, all of it." "Would you really?" Harrison asked. "Because I'm not sure I would." "What do you mean?" Harrison looked around the courthouse that had been his professional home for 8 years, thinking about all the cases he'd heard, all the lives he'd touched, all the small moments of justice he'd tried to deliver. "I mean that maybe some things are more important than careers. Maybe some conversations are worth having even if they cost you everything. But your daughter will learn that her father chose to see the humanity in the man who hurt them both, that he chose understanding over revenge, mercy over justice." Harrison managed a small smile. Maybe that's a better lesson than watching him hide behind judicial robes and legal procedures. As they talked, Harrison could see Judge Patterson through the courtroom doors, reviewing the case file, preparing to decide Danny's fate. It should have been Harrison in that chair, should have been his decision to make, but maybe this was how it was supposed to happen. Maybe some lessons could only be learned by losing everything you thought mattered. "Danny," he said finally, "whatever Judge Patterson decides, I want you to remember our conversation. I want you to remember that you're capable of being better than your worst moment. And I want you to remember that you're the kind of man who chose to listen when you could have chosen to judge." They shook hands one last time, and Harrison watched Danny walk into the courtroom where another judge would decide his fate. Then he turned and walked away from the courthouse, carrying with him the weight of choices made and prices paid, wondering if wisdom always had to cost so much. Harrison sat in his car in the courthouse parking lot, staring at his phone. 17 missed calls from Rebecca, each one probably more furious than the last. 3 voicemails from reporters. A text from Zoe that simply read, "Dad, are you okay? Mom is really mad." He couldn't bring himself to start the engine. Going home meant facing the wreckage of his life, meant explaining to his daughter why her father was being called corrupt on the evening news. Staying meant watching through the windows as another judge decided the fate of the young officer who'd become, impossibly, something like a friend. The phone rang again. This time he answered. "Harrison?" Janet's voice was tight with concern. "Where are you?" "Parking lot. Trying to figure out what comes next. Chief Morrison wants to see you again, and, Harrison, you need to know something. Judge Patterson just recused himself from the Rodriguez case." Harrison's heart stopped. "What? Why?" He said he can't be impartial either, that the media attention and political pressure make it impossible for him to give Rodriguez a fair hearing. "The case is going to Judge Kemp now. Judge William Kemp." Harrison closed his eyes, knowing exactly what that meant. Kemp was 78 years old, a hanging judge from the old school who believed that police officers could do no wrong, and that excessive force was usually just firm policing. If Rodriguez appeared before Kemp, his career was over, and probably his freedom too. "There's something else," Janet continued. "Officer Rodriguez is asking to see you. He's pretty upset about Judge Kemp taking the case." Harrison ended the call and sat in the silence of his car, wrestling with an impossible choice. He could walk away, let the system handle Rodriguez however it would, and focus on salvaging what remained of his own career. It would be the smart choice, the safe choice. Or he could go back in there and fight for what he believed was right, knowing it would probably cost him everything he'd worked for. His phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. Dad, I saw the news. Are you in trouble because you talked to the police officer who arrested you? He stared at the message for a long time before typing back, maybe sweetheart. But sometimes doing what you think is right is more important than avoiding trouble. Her response came quickly, like when you told me to stand up to that bully at school even though I might get detention. Exactly like that. Then I'm proud of you, Dad. Even if Mom isn't. Harrison felt tears prick his eyes. His daughter, his brilliant, brave daughter, understood something that all the ethics committees and chief judges in the world seemed to miss. Sometimes the choice wasn't between right and wrong. Sometimes it was between doing what was safe and doing what was necessary. He started the engine and drove back to the courthouse. Chief Judge Morrison was waiting in his office, along with two people Harrison didn't recognize, a stern woman in a gray suit and a younger man with a briefcase. Harrison, this is Rebecca Chen from the State Judicial Ethics Committee, and David Walsh from the Attorney General's office. Harrison's stomach dropped. They weren't just investigating him anymore, they were building a case. Judge Wells, Rebecca Chen said, consulting a thick folder, we need to discuss your conduct regarding the Rodriguez matter, specifically your decision to meet privately with a defendant in an active case. It wasn't about the case. Any communication with a party to litigation pending before you constitutes misconduct. Walsh interrupted. The appearance of impropriety is irreparably. Stop. Harrison held up his hand, feeling something crystallize inside him. Before we go any further, I need you all to understand something. Morrison frowned. Harrison, I'd advise you to be very careful about what you say here. Bob, with all due respect, I've been careful my entire career. I've followed every rule, dotted every I, crossed every T. And where has it gotten me? Harrison looked around the room at the faces watching him with various degrees of concern and disapproval. Yesterday, a young police officer came to my chambers, not to influence my decision, but to tell me he was sorry for traumatizing my daughter. And I listened to him. I listened because that's what human beings do when someone is genuinely trying to make amends for their mistakes. Judge Wells Chen began, the Judicial Code of Conduct is very clear. The Judicial Code of Conduct is designed to ensure fair trials, not to prevent judges from being human beings. Harrison's voice was rising, but he didn't care anymore. Officer Rodriguez didn't ask me to go easy on him. He didn't try to influence my decision. He asked for nothing except the chance to apologize for hurting my daughter. But the appearance, Walsh started. The appearance is that a judge cared more about understanding than punishing. The appearance is that maybe, just maybe, justice isn't supposed to be completely blind. Maybe it's supposed to see people as they are, flawed, frightened, capable of both terrible mistakes and genuine redemption. Morrison leaned forward. Harrison, you're destroying your career. Stop talking and let us figure out how to minimize the damage. What if I don't want to minimize the damage? Harrison asked quietly. What if I want to stand up and say that what I did was right, even if it was against the rules? The room fell silent. Through the window, Harrison could see reporters setting up cameras on the courthouse steps, preparing for what would undoubtedly be his professional execution. There's something else you need to know, Harrison continued. Judge Patterson recused himself from the Rodriguez case. It's going to Judge Kemp now. Morrison's face went pale. William Kemp. Harrison, that man will throw the book at Rodriguez. I know. And that young officer who made a terrible mistake but who has spent the last 24 hours trying to make it right, is going to have his life destroyed by a judge who sees police officers as infallible and everyone else as guilty, until proven innocent. Chen closed her folder with a sharp snap. Judge Wells, that's not your concern anymore. You're suspended from hearing any cases pending the outcome of this investigation. Then I guess I have nothing left to lose, do I? Harrison stood up, straightening his tie with hands that were surprisingly steady. I'm going to hold a press conference. I'm going to tell the public exactly what happened. why I met with Officer Rodriguez, what we discussed, and why I believe that understanding the people we judge makes us better judges, not compromised ones." "Harrison, that's career suicide," Morrison said desperately. "Maybe. Or maybe it's the most honest thing I've ever done as a judge." He walked to the door, then turned back. "Bob, you taught me that justice is about more than following rules. You taught me that sometimes you have to risk everything to do what's right. I'm finally learning that lesson." An hour later, Harrison stood on the courthouse steps in front of a dozen cameras and twice as many reporters behind him. The building where he'd spent the best years of his career rose like a monument to the principles he was about to either vindicate or destroy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the afternoon air, "2 days ago, I was arrested by Officer Danny Rodriguez based on his assumption that a black man having credit card problems in an expensive restaurant must be committing fraud. Yesterday, that same officer came to my chambers, not to ask for special treatment, but to apologize for the pain he caused my daughter." The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. "I am being investigated for meeting with him. I am being called corrupt, biased, compromised. But I want you to know exactly what happened in that meeting, and why I believe it represents the best of what our justice system can be." Harrison looked directly into the cameras, thinking about Zoe watching at home, about Danny Rodriguez somewhere in the courthouse wondering if his career was over, about Mrs. Chen who had found the grace to forgive when she had every right to seek revenge. "Justice isn't supposed to be blind to humanity," he said. "It's supposed to be blind to prejudice, to wealth, to power. But it should never be blind to the possibility that people can change, that mistakes can become lessons, that mercy can be more powerful than punishment." The questions came fast and sharp, but Harrison answered them all with the same quiet conviction. Yes, he had met privately with Rodriguez. Yes, he understood it violated protocol, and yes, given the chance, he would do it again. As the press conference ended, and the reporters scattered to file their stories, Harrison felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had made his choice. Whatever consequences came next, he would face them knowing he had chosen humanity over procedure, understanding over blind adherence to rules. His phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Dad, I watched your press conference. You were brave. I love you." Another text, this one from an unknown number, "Judge Wells, this is Danny Rodriguez. Thank you for everything. I won't forget what you taught me about mercy." And finally, one that surprised him most of all, from Mrs. Chen's daughter Amy, "Judge Wells, my mother wants you to know that she thinks you are a good man, who made a good choice. She hopes the world learns from your example." Harrison pocketed his phone and walked to his car, leaving behind the courthouse and the career he'd built, but carrying with him something more valuable, the knowledge that he had chosen love over fear, mercy over vengeance, humanity over the cold comfort of rules. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new consequences, new choices, but tonight he was going home to his daughter, ready to begin whatever came next. 6 months later, the community center in Riverside buzzed with nervous energy as Harrison adjusted the microphone at the front of the room. 43 police officers, rookies and veterans alike, sat in folding chairs, their faces reflecting various degrees of skepticism and curiosity. At the back of the room, Danny Rodriguez sat with his training sergeant, his posture attentive, his eyes bright with something that looked like hope. "Good morning," Harrison began, his voice carrying easily across the room. "I'm Harrison Wells. 6 months ago, I was Judge Harrison Wells. Today, I'm here as someone who learned that sometimes the most important lessons come from the moments when everything falls apart." The Judicial Ethics Committee had ultimately decided not to pursue formal sanctions against Harrison. His voluntary resignation and the public support that had surprisingly emerged after his press conference had made prosecution politically impossible. But his days on the bench were over. In their place had come something unexpected, a new career teaching ethics and community relations to law enforcement officers throughout the state. "How many of you have heard the story of Officer Rodriguez and me?" Harrison asked. Most hands went up. Some looked uncomfortable with the question. "Good. Because I don't want to spend today rehashing what went wrong. I want to talk about what went right, and what we can all learn from it." In the audience, Harrison caught sight of a familiar face. Mrs. Chen sat in the third row, flanked by her daughter Amy and a young woman Harrison didn't recognize. When their eyes met, she smiled and nodded encouragingly. "The night Officer Rodriguez arrested me," Harrison continued, "he saw what he expected to see. A black man in trouble must be a black man causing trouble. I saw what I expected to see, a racist cop abusing his power. We were both wrong, and we were both right. The question is, what do we do when reality is more complicated than our assumptions?" A veteran officer in the front row raised his hand. "Mr. Wells, with respect, you weren't there when my partner got shot during a routine traffic stop. Sometimes assumptions keep us alive." "You're absolutely right, officer." "Thompson. Mike Thompson." Harrison's breath caught. This was Danny's partner, the one who'd been shot. "Officer Thompson, you and I need to have a longer conversation after this session, but let me ask you something. Has your experience made you a better cop or a more fearful one?" Thompson's jaw tightened. "Both, I guess. And that's the challenge, isn't it? How do we learn from trauma without letting it turn us into the very thing we're trying to protect people from?" Over the next 2 hours, Harrison guided the officers through scenarios, discussions, and role-playing exercises. He watched faces change as officers began to grapple with the complexity of their work, the split-second decisions, the weight of assumptions, the difference between caution and prejudice. During the break, Danny approached the front of the room. "How am I doing?" Harrison asked quietly. "Better than Judge Kemp would have done with my case," Danny said with a slight smile. That had been the surprise twist in Danny's story. Judge Kemp, faced with overwhelming public attention and pressure, had actually listened to the evidence carefully. Mrs. Chen's testimony about Danny's visit to her home, combined with character witnesses and Danny's own emotional admission of guilt, had resulted in a suspended sentence, mandatory counseling, and community service, tough consequences, but not career-ending ones. "Any regrets about giving up the bench for this?" Danny asked. Harrison looked out at the room full of officers, some young and idealistic, others weathered by years of seeing humanity at its worst, all of them trying to figure out how to do an impossible job in an imperfect world. "Ask me again in a year," he said. "But honestly, I think I might be able to do more good here than I ever did behind a bench." After the session ended and the officers filed out, Harrison found himself alone with Mrs. Chen and her family. "Mrs. Chen," he said, approaching her carefully, "I didn't expect to see you here today. I come to many of Officer Rodriguez's community service events," she said in her careful English. "I want to make sure he learns properly." "And does he learn properly?" The young woman next to Amy stepped forward. "Mr. Wells, I'm Sophia Rodriguez, Danny's niece." Harrison's eyes widened. This was the 15-year-old Danny had mentioned, the one who'd helped him understand what he'd done to Zoe. "Danny has talked about you constantly," Sophia continued, "about what you taught him, about forgiveness and second chances. He's different now, better." "We all are," Amy Chen Martinez added. "This whole experience changed everyone it touched." As they talked, Harrison's phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Dad finished my college application essay about you and Officer Rodriguez. Title, When Justice Looks Like Mercy, can't wait to show you." 18 years old now and headed to college in the fall, Zoe had grown into a young woman who understood that the world was complicated, but that complexity didn't excuse indifference. She'd written about their experience for her college applications, framing it as a lesson about grace and redemption that had shaped her desire to study social work. Mr. Wells. Sofia Rodriguez was looking at him with curious eyes. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think my uncle is a good person who made a bad mistake, or a bad person trying to become good? It was the question Harrison had been wrestling with for 6 months. The answer mattered, not just for Danny, but for every officer in that room, every defendant who would stand before a judge, every person trying to navigate the space between guilt and innocence. I think, Harrison said carefully, that your uncle is a human being, and human beings are capable of both terrible mistakes and genuine redemption. The question isn't whether he's fundamentally good or bad, it's whether he's choosing to learn and grow from his mistakes. And is he? Harrison looked toward the parking lot, where Danny was helping load chairs into a van, laughing with some of the other officers about something. His movements were easier now, less burdened by guilt and self-doubt. He'd found a way to carry his mistakes without being crushed by them. Ask me again in 10 years, Harrison said. But yes, I think he is. As the Chen family prepared to leave, Mrs. Chen took Harrison's hand in both of hers. You are good teacher, she said simply. You help people learn that mercy is not weakness, that understanding is not the same as excusing. After they left, Harrison stood alone in the empty community center, thinking about the path that had brought him here. 6 months ago, he'd been a respected judge with a secure future and a clear sense of right and wrong. Today he was a former judge with an uncertain career and a much more complicated understanding of justice. His phone rang. Rebecca's number. Harrison. His ex-wife's voice was softer than it had been in months. I just wanted you to know, Zoe showed me her college essay about what happened with Officer Rodriguez, about what you taught her about forgiveness and justice. And I think I owe you an apology. I was so focused on protecting her from the consequences of your choices that I didn't see how your choices were actually teaching her something important. Harrison felt a weight he'd been carrying for months begin to lift. Becky, the custody modification hearing is next week. I'm withdrawing the motion. Full joint custody remains in effect. The words hit Harrison like a physical blow, relief so profound it left him momentarily speechless. Thank you, he managed finally. Don't thank me. Thank our daughter. She's the one who convinced me that having a father who chooses principle over safety might not be such a bad thing after all. As Harrison drove home through the streets of the city where he'd built and lost and rebuilt his life, he thought about the strange mathematics of justice. For everything he'd lost, his judgeship, his reputation, his sense of certainty about right and wrong, he'd gained something else. A deeper understanding of humanity. A closer relationship with his daughter, a purpose that felt more meaningful than anything he'd done behind a bench. At a red light, he glanced in his rearview mirror and saw Danny Rodriguez's police cruiser 2 cars back. Their eyes met in the mirror, and Danny raised his hand in a small wave, not the formal acknowledgement of judge and officer, but the recognition of 2 people who'd found their way through the darkness together. The light turned green, and they went their separate ways, but Harrison carried with him the knowledge that some connections transcend the circumstances that create them. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the foundation for our best ones. That evening, Harrison sat with Zoe in their favorite restaurant, not Bella Vista but a small place near her college where they served excellent pasta and nobody recognized them. She was telling him about her plans for social work school, her excitement about working with at-risk youth, her conviction that the world needed more people willing to see complexity instead of choosing sides. "Dad," she said as they waited for dessert, "can I ask you something?" "Always." "Do you ever regret what you did? Giving up being a judge to listen to Officer Rodriguez?" Harrison looked at his daughter, brilliant, compassionate, wise beyond her years, and felt a peace that had eluded him for months finally settle into place. "Sweetheart," he said, "I regret that it took a crisis to teach me that justice without mercy is just vengeance in robes. But I don't regret learning that lesson, and I especially don't regret that you got to watch me learn it." Zoe smiled, the same radiant smile she'd had as a little girl, now tempered with the wisdom that came from seeing the world's complexity and choosing hope anyway. Outside, night settled over the city like a gentle hand, and somewhere in the distance, Danny Rodriguez was probably finishing his shift, going home to his family, carrying with him the knowledge that redemption was possible and second chances were real. In the end, Harrison thought, maybe that was what justice really looked like, not the blindfolded figure with scales, but something more human and more hopeful, the recognition that we are all capable of both harm and healing, and that choosing healing, even when it costs us everything, might be the most important choice we ever make. This story shows us that sometimes the most important lessons come from our biggest mistakes. Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed like a disaster but became a turning point for growth? What would you do if you had to choose between following the rules and following your heart? Share your thoughts below. Your story of second chances and redemption might inspire others who are facing their own crossroads. Daddy. The word that had once brought shame now carried only love, forgiveness, and the promise that some bonds are stronger than any mistake we could ever make.
The end. The story shows how two men, one a judge, one a police officer, find their way from conflict to understanding, ultimately teaching each other and everyone around them that true justice sometimes looks like mercy, and that second chances can transform not just individuals but entire communities. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.